it is time for us to talk about the main event of the evening, and it is for the lightweight title. Khabib Nurmagomedov was the long-time champion, UFC 254. He lay his gloves in the center of the octagon and said, "That's it, I'm done." So the title's been vacated, and it will be contested this weekend. It's Charles Oliveira taking on Michael Chandler, and I think the big fascinating point about this fight is the way that both men have managed to reach this title fight, because Charles Oliveira entered the UFC as a very young fighter. It's taken him 11 years and a failed spell as featherweight to reach this opportunity. 11 years for Charles Oliveira to reach the title fight. Michael Chandler, 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great way to sum it up. I mean, Michael Chandler has had an illustrious career outside the UFC. He's been there forever. I mean, he's at a strong camp. He's with Henry Hooft, and I mean, he's in there grinding with the likes of Usman and not Usman anymore, but Gilbert Burns, Rockhold, a lot of those guys who sharpen iron against each other in there. Chandler's always been on my radar since the Eddie Alvarez fight, and Chandler's first fight in the UFC was just such a weird one. I think that a lot of fans who had never seen Chandler before in Bellator might have a little bit too high of hopes for him. I don't really even know where Chandler stands right now. He's coming off of a couple knockout wins in Bellator. He suffered the loss of Patricia Freire. Oliveira is one of my top favorite fighters, I think, in the UFC. I mean, I was originally from Houston. I know his fights out of Houston. Just a guy who's really been everywhere. Like you said, a failed stint at featherweight, came back. The Kevin Lee fight was phenomenal. Tony Ferguson fight's phenomenal. I mean, he's just really been putting it on. His striking has gotten better. I think he's gotten much better wrestling, and his grappling has always been there. So super, super interesting fight. What is your take on this fight?
Really fascinated by this fight. Not so much in terms of the fight itself, which I do think is going to be compelling, and we'll get into that in a lot more detail. I almost sort of, in a strange way, sort of feel sorry for both of these fighters, because regardless of who wins it, and I say this for a lot of fighters who compete for a vacated belt, there's almost this element of paper champion about them. Because we saw how dominant Khabib was, just turning over guys like Conor, Gaethje, Dustin Poirier. And because these guys became champion without beating Khabib, there's always going to be this sort of asterisk next to them. But I think it's doubly worse for both of these opponents, because not only have you got Khabib sort of hanging over you, like a cloud hanging over you, you've also got Dustin Poirier. And a lot of people believe Dustin Poirier is the pound for pound lightweight in the world right now.
Yeah, 100%. It's such a weird matchup. And, I think a lot of people have alluded to, they wanted two guys who didn't have losses to Khabib. They wanted to get a new guy who's fresh. I mean, you have Gaethje, you have Poirier, you have McGregor, the three other sharks circling this division. They've all been, beaten and basically dominated by Khabib. So you want to build up a guy who's, doesn't have that Khabib loss on his record. And I agree. I mean, you do get kind of the paper champion feel. And yeah, it's going to be weird to where it goes from here. Because, I mean, Dariush beats Tony Ferguson, arguably, the number one contender for years and years and years. I really don't see Dariush getting a title shot after that. I mean, I would have to imagine, it's going to be Gaethje, Poirier, or McGregor in the mix after that, don't you?
I think so. I think whoever wins between Conor and Dustin is going to get the first shot at the winner of this fight.
I agree. I mean, I think that's like the most UFC logic that makes the most sense. Yeah. I think, so it'll be interesting. As far as the matchup goes, man, I don't know. I know some of the fans are favoring Oliveira, and I think Oliveira is the odds-on Vegas favorite right now. But I don't know. I feel like he's a little bit too hittable, and he's a little bit too willing to stand and trade for me to trust him against Chandler.
And I think as well, I agree with you in that regard. And Oliveira also had a lot of issues when it came to pressure. And that was something that really bothered him early on in his career, and especially when he fought at featherweight. He has started to iron those flaws out to an extent. I'm also not 100% sure how good Charles Oliveira actually is, because yes, he does have this 8-fight winning streak, but the only two notable wins on that record are Kevin Lee, who is notorious in how inconsistent he is, and a Tony Ferguson, who some people believe maybe is past his best. So we don't 100% know how good Charles Oliveira actually is. In the same way, we
Yeah,
don't know how good Michael Chandler actually is because he's only had one fight in the UFC, and that was
yeah.
a quick one-punch knockout against Dan Hooker.
I agree. It's very tough. I mean, Michael Chandler knocking out guys like Sidney Outlaw and stuff over in Bellator is not really a good indication of, UFC talent. I don't know where I would place Sidney Outlaw and Brent Primus and the UFC lightweight division. I don't think they would be that high. But I agree. I think Oliveira does really well when he's able to pressure. He had some fights where he was able to pressure. He was also a guy known to wilt. Like you said, he did not like being pressured. He had a ton of fights where the moment that someone was able to turn the tide on him, he fell out. The Kevin Lee fight was interesting because that was really the first fight where the momentum was in Kevin Lee's favor, and then he shifted and took over. Kevin Lee got a little bit lazy and got guillotined, but yeah, I tend to favor Chandler in this fight. I think that Chandler is going to be able to pressure him. And if the same Oliveira comes out who came out against Tony Ferguson, he was just far too hittable, far too willing to stand. I mean, his head was sitting up bolt straight, almost Donald Cerrone-esque, just waiting to be hit with jabs. Chandler looked super. I mean, the Chandler fight against Dan Hooker is so hard to take anything away from. I mean, it was a bizarre fight, but I mean, he looked super mobile. I mean, it was a pretty, good setup to his overhand. I think if he stays mobile, he works a pressure game. He doesn't, head in, single leg him and go for and get guillotined. I think he has a pretty good chance of knocking Charles Oliveira out.
In a very similar board, I think Chandler for me is sort of your quintessential wrestle boxer. I've heard a lot of people compare him to sort of like a lightweight Chad Mendes. He sort of uses the threat of the takedown to set up that big right hand, and we have seen him in Bellator fight guys who are very similar to Charles Oliveira. The one that sticks in my mind was Gotti Yamauchi. And when it did go into a grappling match and Yamauchi was trying to throw up his legs, Chandler was neutralizing that. So if it does go to the ground, I can see him trying to neutralize some of Oliveira's submission threats. Especially when I think Oliveira's a better submission threat when he's on top rather than off his back. So he's not really like a Tony Ferguson type. I'm also a bit concerned with Chandler in terms of the diversity of his striking abilities. He has a good jab and a great right hand, but that's really it.
I agree. I do think he's a little bit limited as far as his capabilities go. He also, I mean, he's very prone to being leg kicked. The Brett Primus fight, but I think, Benson leg kicked him pretty well. I mean, he did leg kick Benson as well, but I think Oliveira, it's really tough, like you said, to quantify how good Oliveira is, but Oliveira is very varied. If you say one about him, he has a very varied offense. I mean, he has wins with spinning back elbows. I mean, he's been working in flying knees, leg kicks. I mean, he has some crafty ways to level change. I just don't see him. A lot of that stuff is really dependent on him being the pressure fighter, and I just don't know if he's going to be able to pressure Chandler.
And I think as well, a good point as well, you mentioned about Charles Oliveira and his diversity. If he has one sniff of your neck or one sniff of your arm, he is going to take it. He is a good clutch submission guy, very similar to Brian Ortega.
Yeah, 100%. He's got his. I mean, the armbar against Tony Ferguson was insane. I mean, guillotine against Kevin Lee. I mean, he has so many submissions. He's also a glass cannon in a way. I mean, he's been submitted. He's had some submission losses. I mean, submitted by Anthony Pettis among some others. So I think it's such a tough fight to call. I don't know why. I've just been really at a loss and coming up with a blank with this fight. It's really tough to see. I mean, there are some foils that they faced in their past that kind of give us a little bit. But like you said, it's really tough to know where Oliveira is at this point, and it's really tough to know where Chandler is at this point. The only thing that, I'm basing my judgment off of on picking Chandler is that Oliveira is just a little bit too hittable, and he's been known to fold once he, is beat up a little bit.
It's very interesting at the moment with the poll on the YouTube page. At the moment, they've got Charles Oliveira 51% to win this fight, Michael Chandler 49%. So they've got this one too close to call as well. In my opinion, and this sounds strange, in my opinion, we're not going to know who's going to win this fight until Tony Ferguson versus Dariush. Because if we see the old Tony Ferguson that blows through Beneil, it's going to make Charles Oliveira's win against him look so much better. But if Tony struggles or even loses, the questions about how good Oliveira is going to come to the fore. At the moment, I think it's very touch and go. I'm going to say Chandler. I think Chandler, I'm going to say second round knockout. Chandler gets this done.
I'm going to go Chandler second round knockout as well. I agree. I think that being able to base the wins, although they're different stylistic matchups, it's not like a 1-to-1 comparison. I agree. It's really tough to know where Tony is. That Oliveira win, it's just a tough one to read against Ferguson. Like I said, I mean, the striking was interesting, but I mean, just shutting him out on the ground, no one's really ever done that to Tony before. So we don't really have any basis to know if that's going to, Oliveira still has that in his repertoire. His wrestling looked great. Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think I'm really excited to see how Chandler and Oliveira match up in the wrestling. I mean, Oliveira has a really varied takedowns in the Ferguson fight. And I'm pretty excited to see. I think Chandler could get in trouble if he, gets in some scrambles with Oliveira. I think that Oliveira is definitely one of the most dangerous grapplers Chandler's ever fought.